Hello everyone, the subject of today's research video is Oliver. I have to admit, Oliver is one of my favourite characters in the Railway series, in part as his basis is one of my favourite tank engine classes, so this has been a really fun one for me to look into. From the information in the books The Island of Sodor, Its People, History and Railways, and Sodor, Reading Between the Lines, we know that although Oliver wears the number 1436, this is likely not the number he wore while working on the mainland. My aim is to look through all the available evidence and try and find out the number of the real-life engine who now works on the Little Western with Duck, Toad and the others. Right, so there are two paths we can take with Oliver. Either he's based on one of the real Great Western 1400 class tank engines, or he could be a fictional extra member of the class, much like the other Railway series characters Donald, Douglas and Bear. For now, I'm going to focus on Oliver being based on a real 1400 class, but later on in the video I'll explore the option of him being a fictional addition. Let's start by establishing his prototype. Oliver is a Great Western 1400 class 042 tank engine built between 1932 and 1936 at Swindon. There were 75 built, originally numbered 4800 to 4874, until they were renumbered 1400 to 1474 in 1946, as their previous numbers were required for the members of the 2800 class that would be converted to oil burning. The class found work over virtually the whole Great Western and later Western region networks, before withdrawals began in February 1956 and the last engines were withdrawn in May 1965. To find out which of the 1400s is the real Oliver, there are three main factors to take into consideration. Cross-referencing the 1400s which have the correct details will hopefully give us a smaller number of locos which can be Oliver. Let's take them one at a time. Firstly, let's take into account Oliver's livery. We know from the Island of Sodor book that Oliver was allowed to revert to his Great Western livery. The word revert here is important, as it implies Oliver would have worn this specific livery when he worked on the Great Western. The roundel logo was introduced in 1934 and only applied to 1400s built after this. It was short-lived and soon replaced with the simple GWR lettering. 1400s built before 1934 were very unlikely to receive this updated totem, suggesting Oliver is more likely one of the 45 engines built after this time, numbers 1430 to 1474. As well as his restored livery being instructive, so is the one worn when Oliver is rescued. He is painted in lined British Railways green with the early crest. Now, this wasn't the most common livery by the time the 1400s were withdrawn. All 1400s were painted British Railways black with the early crest when they passed into BR ownership from 1948 onwards, and many wore this livery for the rest of their working lives. Some were then repainted into BR green from 1957 onwards, originally with the early crest, but more common was the later crest. My primary resource when going through the British Railways livery data was Peto's Register. It gives an accurate account of the 1400s, including their livery history, as was available at the time of publishing in 1998. I worked my way through all 75 locos in the register, discounting those that did not wear British Railways green with the early crest. To make sure this information was accurate, I checked every single one of them with the most recently available photo of the engine. In some cases I found the register to have inaccuracies and omissions, but overall it was very handy. 22 engines received lime green livery, but it was a long process to get a complete list of those that kept the early crest until the end of their working lives. I found that only 3 of these engines, numbers 1446, 1453 and 1458, kept the lime green livery with the early BR crest until they were withdrawn. These would all have had received the Great Western roundel from the start of their working lives. I have also been told from correspondence with Clive Spong how thorough Wilbert was with liveries, so I believe that the depiction of both of Oliver's liveries are what the Reverend had in mind. So, we've narrowed down the possible real-life basis of Oliver down to 3 locomotives. Not bad, but let's try to narrow it down a little bit more. The next factor to take into account is the location of Oliver's branch line. We know that Oliver left his home in the west of England to come to Sodor as his branch line was closing. The Island of Sodor states Oliver reached Sodor in 1967, meaning the branch line could have closed prior to that year. This would make sense as no 1400s were left on branch lines by 1967. Further evidence of Oliver's withdrawal date can be found in this illustration of him working on his branch line. It looks like he is near St Mary's Crossing on the Golden Valley line. This area was one of the last areas the 1400s found work across the whole network. The 4th Audrey Extravaganza also confirmed Oliver worked the train known as the Chalford Auto, which passes through the Golden Valley. Therefore, Oliver would most likely have been allocated to Gloucester and worked the Sharpness and Chalford lines. As these were the last lines run by Autotrains, the closure of these is likely the news that prompted his crews to set about the Great Escape. So, what we're after for engines contending to be Oliver are 1400s that survived until at least 1964 and worked on the Chalford Auto and ended BR life wearing the correct livery. Only 2 engines fulfill this criteria, 1453 and 1458. So, now that we know a little bit more about where Oliver definitely worked and what he would have looked like, we need to factor in the details we can glean from Oliver's escape. In the Thomas the Tank Engine Man, Walbert says that the story Escape is fiction, but he believes it would just be possible. And I agree with him, it takes a bit of a leap of the imagination, but it's just about possible that Oliver managed to escape from the clutches of British Railways, be a fugitive for many months, avoid detection by the baying, prowling diesels, and reach the sanctuary of Sodor in one piece with his coach and brake van. To try and work out the timeline, I'm going to start near the end of Oliver's journey. Based on what time Oliver arrived at the works in Escape, we can put a rough time of year on the story. It doesn't tell us when Oliver arrived in Barrow yet, just when he escaped across the Walney Channel. When the engines reach the works, dawn can be seen breaking overhead. Douglas leaves Tidmouth at midnight and wears a Class J goods head code, so is subject to a 25 mph speed limit from Tidmouth to Barrow, meaning it would have taken roughly 3 hours and 15 minutes to go the 80 or so miles. There may well be additional delays such as waiting at signals, letting other trains pass, or getting a banker up Gordon's Hill, things like that. Let's therefore give Douglas a rounded up 4 hours for the trip and say he arrives around 4 AM. He then shunts his trucks and collects his new train, meets and talks to Oliver, and the crews prepare the escape with the labels, removing Oliver's side rods and chalking the word scrap all over. This probably takes another hour here, so the party sets off back to Sodor around 5 AM. Douglas then runs tender first the first 20 or so miles to Craven's Gate. We don't see his head code in the dark, but it's likely another Class J, which means for the best part of an hour until they reach the works, including the time they were halted by the inspector at Barrow and possibly stopping at other signals too. I think we're looking at an arrival time in Craven's Gate around 6 AM if everything I have said is correct. The fact the night foreman is still on duty here would seem to confirm this. Looking at dawn and sunrise times in 1967, that would mean it is likely Oliver escaped around March 1967 if it happens early in the year, or September 1967 if it happens later on. I think we can conclude it was the earlier date of escape, as reading between the lines mentions Oliver had an extensive overhaul when he reaches Sodor, and at the end of Enterprising Engines he is seen working on the Little Western. Therefore, I think the arrival in March is far more likely, as it gives time for the overhaul to take place and for Oliver to be in service on the Little Western by the end of the year. It would also mean less time on his escape from the West Country to Barrow is needed, and therefore a bit more believable. Before we get into the journey, there is also Oliver's time spent in Barrow to consider. He has run out of coal on a siding here, and the island of Sodor knows that he and his crew were almost in despair by the time Douglas found them. This suggests he was in the predicament for some time. Barrow Yard was a large area, and Oliver's crew, who have proved themselves very canny by this point, may have managed to smuggle him somewhere infrequently visited until their luck changed. So, with Oliver being rescued in around March 1967 and having arrived in Barrow some days, weeks or even months before, it is now time to look if any of our relevant engines were late withdrawals to make Oliver's escape at all plausible. Aside from the preserved examples of the 1400 class, which I will talk about a little bit later, only 9 survived until the last year of auto train services in 1964, and 1453 and 1458 are 2 of these. This does still leave a long time to spend on the run for the possible Olivers. 1453 and 1458 were withdrawn in November of 1964. There are hints in Enterprising Engines that escape was anything but easy when Oliver states that they had close encounters before the final stop and search at Barrow Station Throat. They also had to spend some time in an old quarry siding, removing one of the access rails and filling the cutting with debris. That would have taken some time to arrange and then even longer to clear and put right. The island of Sodor notes that they could only travel by night and had to hide during the day, moving from checkpoint to checkpoint. These had to be pre-arranged with friendly signalmen, and it is noted that the journey takes longer than planned. Considering Oliver, Isabel and Toad were stolen property, care was of the utmost importance. At times it may have taken days or weeks to move from one safe zone to the next. Not only do agreeable railwaymen have to be found, convinced to help and be on duty at the right time, but there also needs to be a place to hide about 100 feet of rolling stock. It is likely that Oliver had to spend a lot of time waiting for his opportunity, as care was also needed to be taken with his coal and water levels. There would be no point firing him if there was little chance of making progress that night, as coal and water would have been harder to come by than when he was legitimately running before. After Control heard about the mystery train and tried to find out what was happening, there would likely be times when the crew had to lie low for agonisingly long periods of time until the heat died down, all the while worrying their fugitive engine would be discovered. The island of Sodor notes that they had many close escapes, which is probably the main reason why the escape was so extended. That isn't to say that it wasn't well thought through, as both the island of Sodor and reading between the lines note that it was carefully planned beforehand. The crew did have some degree of warning, as reading between the lines state that they knew the line was due to be closed, so had time to make some degree of arrangement. And the most important thing is it worked, as all 3 stowaways and their crew made it to Sodor. From planning the route to arrival on Sodor, therefore, took roughly about 2 to 3 years, much longer than anyone was expecting. Both locomotives remaining do have good claims to being the real Oliver, but I believe one has a slightly superior claim. Let's take a look at one final piece of anecdotal evidence for each in turn, starting with 1453. This engine at one point lost its number plate, and a wooden one added in its place looks distinctly different. Could Oliver be 1453 and swap plates to cover their identity? Or maybe he was 1458, who for a year worked alongside the real 1436 and may have kept their plates as a memento of their scrapped friend. I don't think either of those bits of information are useful for finding the correct Oliver, however I thought they were lovely stories, so I wanted to include them. I think the most critical bit of information is that 1458 was only stationed at Gloucester for the last 3 months of its working life. That does not give his crew much time to plan an escape, so it is hard to fit in with the narrative of Oliver's last weeks on the Western region. 1453 was there for 2 years, so fits in much better. Therefore, I think 1453 is the most likely engine to be the real Oliver. Before we go into his working life of what I believe to be the real Oliver, there are 3 small problems that need to be addressed. Firstly, we can see D5701 to the right of the signal box in this illustration. We know it is D501 as it was the only Class 28 to receive BR Blue livery, as mentioned in my previous BOCO research video. There is a link in the description if you want to check that out. However, D5701 did not gain this livery until 1967, which is after the time I have placed the story Escape in the timeline. However, the illustrations for enterprising engines were not started until 1968, so it's likely a minor detail missed by both author and illustrator. The illustration looks too sunny and green to be a November in Britain, and even if escape did happen during or after November 1967, that does not give enough time for Oliver to finish the escape, arrive in Barrow, be rescued by Douglas, be mentored at the works, and be put to work on the Little Western by the end of the year. Next, reading between the lines makes an awkward statement that Oliver left the West Country in 1967. There were no 1400s left on British railways by this time, the last 2 were withdrawn in 1965 and preserved. Even if there was one left, there would certainly be no work for them, and no branches were about to close that the 1400s ever had anything to do with. As such, I think this is one of those infrequent times where Christopher Awdry takes some of his father's lore and gets the meaning slightly wrong. I think we should stick with Wilbert's wording here and say that Oliver arrived on Sodor in 1967. Lastly, 1453 didn't have a top feed at the time of withdrawal. Neither did 1458. Both carried a top feed during their working lives at some point, but the 1400s swapped their boilers around often and so would sometimes leave the works having gained or lost a top feed. Interestingly, 2 out of the 6 illustrations of Oliver before he gets his overhaul in enterprising engines show him without a top feed. So you could say that he may have arrived without a top feed, but was restored with a boiler that had one. I will admit that this is a bit of a stretch though. Despite this, these engines are the closest match for Oliver, and 1453 is the best of all. Looking at Wilbert's model of Oliver, it lacks a top feed too. The K's kit Oliver was produced from did not feature one, either as a moulded part of the boiler or as an optional attachment. Wilbert's models sometimes got modifications, like James's running board, but smaller things like Thomas's extended side tanks and duct sandboxes were not replicated on the models. As such, I don't think we can say that as his model didn't have a top feed, Oliver was not supposed to have one in real life. Speaking of Audrey's model of Oliver, this is where the number 1436 came from. The kit came with number plates and transfers to be added, and the number on the plates was 1436. Both Audreys note it is not likely Oliver's original number. We know this engine didn't escape from the West Country, as it was withdrawn from Southall and did not work on the Chelford autos. It also was never painted into BR green of any kind. As far as I can tell, the kit included the transfers for either the Great Western lettering, worn by Wilbur's model, or the plainer GWR lettering. I am not sure if they were ever included at the same time though, so I'm not sure if Wilbur had the option of GWR lettering when he was detailing Oliver. I found no evidence that the round door was ever included in the kits. We have an idea of where Oliver's totem comes from though. The foreword of Oliver the Western Engine mentions the Dart Valley Railway, and Pat Hammonds mentions in an article that Oliver was inspired by a trip to that line. Number 1420 is preserved there, and during the time of enterprising engines and Oliver the Western Engine, it wore the roundel badge on its side. When the latest editions of the Railway series were released with their more detailed scans of the illustrations, fans noticed that Oliver has the number 1420 in some illustrations of Oliver the Western Engine. The numbers are quite indistinct and only visible in some images. We know that the illustrator for this book, Peter Edwards, went on holiday with his family and visited steam railways and museums to base his Railway series pictures on. He mentions a holiday to Devon where the Dart Valley Railway was, so it seems he may have included 1420's number when he was illustrating from life for some illustrations of Oliver. Looking back at older editions, the number cannot be seen on Oliver's buffer beam as far as I can tell. It may be that this number was removed from the final print, but better technology on the new releases was able to pick up the detail on the original paintings. We know that in later books in the series, Wilbur got to check the illustrations before they were printed, and perhaps he requested the number be removed as it did not match the one on his model, or he did not want the number to match one on a preserved engine. These are just guesses though, and I'm not sure we will ever find out the reason the number couldn't be seen until recently. One final point about 1420. It received the nickname Bolivar, which sounds very close to Oliver. It was almost certainly an inspiration behind the name, much like the Arsdale Railway naming system. Bolivar comes from the locals' name for the branch line. Although the origins are uncertain, leading theories are that it was named after Bolivar, the ship in Rudyard Kipling's poem The Ballad of Bolivar, or perhaps from Simon Bolivar, a leading figure in South American republicanism. No matter the original, it seems to be the reason that Oliver has his name. As well as 1420, 1442, 1450 and 1466 were preserved as well. All these engines received the wrong BR livery or crest to be Oliver, and only 1420 ever worked at Gloucester, but only for a couple of weeks. I think this is a good place to bring back the idea that Oliver could be a fictitious 76th member of the class. This would work by keeping basically the same story as one of our two finalists for Oliver as described in this video. They would have likely been built in April or May 1936, and so would have received the roundel logo, and it's perfectly possible they could have got the correct livery and kept it to the end of their life, and could even have received a top feed too. I don't think it's likely this engine could have survived any longer than 1453 and 1458 on the mainland though, so the story of the escape would be the same. Luckily, both numbers it would have worn, firstly 4875 and later 1475 after 1946, would have been available. Both this theory and the one that Oliver is based on a real engine are equally valid. If we say Oliver was number 1453 though, we know a lot about his working life. He was built in lot 287 as number 4853 and cost £2,255, which in 2024 is over £200,000. He came into service on the 23rd of July 1935 and was allocated to Stourbridge. His main duties here would have been on the auto train shuttles between Stourbridge Junction and Stourbridge Town. On the 17th of July 1936, an auto train Oliver was propelling crashed into a stationary goods train due to a signalling failure. The driver was in the auto coach cabin and died of his injuries. The auto coach was badly damaged, but I cannot find a record of it being condemned. Oliver was undamaged. Oliver may have been repainted during the war, and if so, would have received an unlined black livery with GWR lettering. After the war, this would have been replaced with green, but kept the GWR lettering and not returning to the roundel. At the beginning of 1946, Oliver was moved to Swindon. Here he mostly would have worked the Chippenham to Cowan branch, again on auto trains. He was also recorded as working the Malmesbury branch in 1946 and the Tetbury branch in August 1948. On the 16th of November 1946, Oliver was renumbered to 1453. With nationalisation on the 1st of January 1948, Oliver would have been repainted sometime after this. His first livery may have been green or black with the full British Railways lettering on his tanks, or even no lettering at all. However, this livery only lasted until October, when BR Black was settled on, and from 1946 the BR crest was added. And then from 1957 onwards received his repaint into BR lined green, still carrying the early crest. In March 1949, Oliver was transferred to Weymouth. Here he would have worked the Abbotsbury branch line and had the distinction of pulling the last passenger service along the branch on the 29th of November 1951. Part of the branch remained open for goods, which Oliver is likely to have worked. He would also have worked the mainline local auto trains between Weymouth and Yeovil and Weymouth and Mayton Newton. On the 22nd of October 1956, Oliver rescued an engine stuck in a tunnel. West Country Class number 34093 Saunton was hauling a 7-coach morning train from Weymouth to Bournemouth when it slipped and was brought to a standstill in Bincombe Tunnel. The train was stranded. The next train along the line was 1453 with a Weymouth to Maiden Newton auto who shunted the train out the tunnel. Oliver stayed at Weymouth with a brief time away in 1952 at Bristol Bath Road until DMUs took over his work and he was moved to Slough in March 1960. Oliver's work at Slough was mostly autos on the Marlow branch until October 1961, when he was reallocated close by to Banbury, at which time his duties were on the Banbury's Princes Risborough autos and the Aylesbury Princes Risborough autos. When these services too were lost to DMUs, Oliver was moved for the last time to Gloucester. Oliver arrived at Gloucester in July 1962 and would have worked here until withdrawal over 2 years later. His duties here were mainly pulling the Chalford and Sharpness autos, and he pulled the last ever Sharpness auto on the 31st of October 1964, with both lines closing on the same day. He was withdrawn on the 9th of November 1964 and is listed as being sold for scrap. By the end of his working life, Oliver had travelled over 665,000 miles. Well, I think this video has gone on about long enough, but we may well hear a little bit more about Oliver in what I'm expecting to be my next research piece. This will be looking at Isabel and the other auto coaches, and we'll be continuing the Little Western research which started with Toad. I'll put a link in the description for this video. Thanks for watching everyone. This video has been a long time coming, even more so as I needed to re-record the whole thing as I strained my voice the first time round, and so wasn't happy with the quality. I have several people to thank for having a look over my research notes over the years. A big thanks to Sleeper Agent, Sorter Scouse, Little Engine and NickTrain123. I'll list their Twitter profiles in the description so you can go and give them a follow. Thanks for now.